And I know I mentioned part of our background of acquaintanceship over the telephone. But Captain Wright and Mrs. Wright were patients of my father as a doctor.
Yes, sir.
For many years. And my mother and Mrs. Wright together were active in conducting the yearly Confederate Memorial Day exercises out at the cemetery, Oakland Cemetery. And I used to go out there as a little boy and put up flags with my sisters and the other UDC people. And I told you about the story that Captain Wright told my father, didn't I? About
you may have alluded to it, but I'd love to hear it. I don't.
Well, he had one leg.
Yes, Captain William Ambrose Wright.
That's right, William A. Wright. And he told my father that after he had been wounded, they took him up to the hospital, and he said that he was, after began to recuperate, that he had a terrible feeling of ants crawling on his leg. Have you heard that?
It's been a while, yes, sir.
Yeah, but he said that finally he got better, went out to where his leg was buried and dug it up, and sure enough, ants were crawling all over his leg. You've heard that?
No, actually,
he told my father that as a joke.
So the ants really were?
No, he just said that he was laughing at that, what he felt like it.
I haven't heard that many stories about the man. I turned the tape on just before you began, so I'd just like to mention the date and time.
Yeah, all right.
To get into it. Today is Monday, August 28th, 1994, and I'm speaking with Mr. and Mrs. Robert Stephens. And the story you just told was actually about my grandfather's grandfather, I believe.
Yeah, Wright, Brian's grandfather.
I believe that's
it was our father. Was Captain Wright?
His father was Arthur Buist Bryan.
All right, then
so I think it was his grandfather.
It was his grandfather.
Who was the Comptroller General of the state of Georgia.
That's right, absolutely, yeah.
And the other fella who has told me about that,
yeah.
My best friend's father was Jimmy Bentley.
Yeah.
His son Sam is my age.
Mm-hmm.
And
I've known Sam for a long time. I mean, Jimmy for a long time.
Well, he also told me of Comptroller General stories, at least.
Yeah.
Well, I'm asking questions really about the World War II era.
Yeah.
But I can't ask too many questions without having heard what that brings to your mind. And if I simply asked you what you think of, or what some of your experiences were during the World War II era,
mm-hmm.
Could you give me a little idea of?
Be glad to.
Of that. What were you up to during the World War II era, Mr. Stephens?
Well, let me sort of give just the chronological idea. In 1935, I graduated at the university and went as an exchange student to Germany, and was there for 35 and 36 at the height of Hitler's power, actually, because while I was there, he moved his troops into the Rhineland for the first time, and I happened to be making a visit from Hamburg, where I was studying, to go to Brussels to visit with Morton Hodgson, who was originally from Athens and was with the Coca-Cola company there. And when I got to Brussels from Hamburg, the newspapers were full of the fact that the train that I had taken was the last train to leave before he occupied the Rhineland. And everybody here, my parents all thought that World War II had started. But of course we had the appeasement by Chamberlain, and that took that pressure off. But nobody that I could talk with in Germany thought that Hitler was going to ever give up till he had World War II started. And I made a talk on about that, preparation for war. When I got back here, my mother invited me to go down to Westland, where she had graduated, and talk to the Alumni Society. And I put in there the fact that everybody could see that Hitler was preparing for war. And I was prepared to, I was prepared to accept that, knowing that I had a reserve officers commission that I had gotten from the university, and that being a reserve officer, I was eligible to be called to active duty at any time. Well, because of the occupation of the Rhineland and other things, President Roosevelt was trying to get America prepared for the possibilities of Hitler's aggressive warfare. And when I came back, I was teaching in our history department at the University of Georgia. And the preparation for war was continuing. And in 1938, Grace and I were married. And in 1939, we took our second honeymoon trip. And we went to Williamsburg, and then we went on up to visit a cousin of mine who lived in Pennsylvania. And I had a radio installed in my automobile because we were just had known and could see and understood that Hitler was on the eve of invading Russia. And while we were listening to the radio, moving in our trip from Williamsburg to Washington, D.C., they announced that the World War II had really started with the invasion of Russia by the German forces. Well, now, everybody that had a reserve commission was more or less alerted to the fact that they would be called into the service, and that they might be called in for 1 year of temporary duty, because the war had not been declared, but we were trying to be sure that we were ready, the president was. And I had, with that sort of feeling, I still teaching. I started the law school, and that whole term of 3 years, or two, and really counting the summer 2 years, I had the idea that as soon as I finished the law school, I was going to have to get a leave from the university and go for a year of active duty on my officer's commission. And I guess April of the 1941, when I was about to graduate from the law school, which was going to be in August, I had a telephone call from Alfred Means, who was from Athens originally. And Alfred was the head of the FBI in Atlanta. Mm-hmm. And Alfred asked me to, if I didn't want to go into the FBI, that the FBI was building up on the basis of the activity of the German activity, and they needed agents who could speak German. Well, I would have satisfied that. I wasn't fluent in a sense, but having spent a year in Germany, it's the reason that he got in touch with me.
Of course.
And I told him I'd have to think about it. Grace and I talked about it, and then I went to see a friend of mine named Ace Callan, who was in college. Oh well, I'd known him all my life. And Ace, I found out, was already on active duty with the 4th, what later became the 4th Service Command in Atlanta, with the Army Intelligence. I didn't know that, but at the time that I called him. So I went to see him, and I said, Ace, give me some information about the FBI. Do you think I'll be satisfied going into the FBI? He said, well, I'll tell you what you have to decide. Says, if you are going to decide that if you wake up a call from the headquarters of the FBI in the middle of the night, and you answer the phone, and your wife hears you say, yes, all right, I'll be there. And then you get up and put on a belt of pistols and start out, and your wife asks you where you're going, and you said, I can't tell you. She said, if she'll be satisfied with that, then you go in the FBI. Well,
how would you?
Naturally, I was not happy with that idea at all.
So we decided that that was not what I would do, but in the meantime, Asa, knowing that we who had reserve commissions were anticipating the fact that we would be called into active duty for a year, and several people had already been called. Victor Crow from Athens had been called, and several others, and we decided that I decided that I would. Asa told me that if I would like to go ahead and volunteer to go in 1941, in the summer of 1941, that he would get me, if possible, thought he could get me assigned to the headquarters in Atlanta of the intelligence service. Well, that sounded fine, to be that close to home for your active duty. And I told him, well, that'll be fine. And I had told Alfred Means I wasn't interested in the FBI. Well, I did hear from Asa and the headquarters in Atlanta. And in August, I graduated, but I had, in the meantime, gotten back in touch with Asa, and he said that they had filled their place in Atlanta out of Washington, D.C., but that if I was still interested, he would send me on active duty, automated active duty they would, at Spartanburg, South Carolina. And I would go there and be the assistant public relations officer and intelligence officer. Well, that sounded just about as good as you could possibly do. And everybody that I knew, like I said, was expecting to be having people breathing down your neck about doing that. So I thought that being 130 miles away from Athens, that would be a good thing to do. So I made application for active duty, and I got my orders to be at Spartanburg in the first week of September of 1941. And Spartanburg was a very nice place. It had been a site of a camp during World War I, and I had a cousin whose husband had been stationed there, and he knew some people there. And then I had the Cleveland family were married into the Reynolds family in Atlanta, and my sister had married a Reynolds, and they just, and then we had some people who were kin to us in Washington, Georgia, and the Alexanders, and Judge Cease in Spartanburg was Alexander's, had married an Alexander, so it was just fine that we would go there. So we went up to Spartanburg, I did, to sort of look around before Grace and the children, where we had one child, moved.
So born in 1941?
Yeah. I went up there to look around, and the man that was the post intelligence and public relations officer, I found out, was from Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, where my cousin lived, and was a great friend of theirs. And that was just marvelous to have that note there. So he was going to help us get a place. And all of a sudden, when I got back up there, he said that he was going to leave because General Griswold, who had been in Spartanburg as the head of the camp, the Infantry Replacement Training Center there, General Griswold had been transferred down to Augusta to take over the 4th Motorized Division, and he was going down there to be his public relations and intelligence officer. And he said that we could have his house to rent. Well, that was just marvelous. We didn't have to look around for a house, anything. And we got the house, and got the dog, and got this woman that was a cook.
Was that his dog or your dog?
His dog. We became our dog.
The house, the dog,
yeah. So we were all ready.
Everything worked out beautifully.
And I reported for active duty there about I think my orders put me there about the 6th or 7th of September, being dated about the 1st September. Well, I had, I didn't have any real training in intelligence, but what I knew that I had to do, being a lawyer, would be helpful. But the thing that was most fascinating was that at Spartanburg, at that time, there was a new brigadier general that had just been in there about a month. And his name was General Alexander M. Patch. And I had never heard of General Patch, but he was on the way up because of the expansion of the Army. And in 1942, in the earlier part of 41, in the early part of 41, they'd had maneuvers in North Carolina, and they were trying to pick out new commanding regular Army commanding officers. And two men had been picked out from the outstanding maneuvers there, and one was General Patch and one was General Eisenhower. And General Patch was sent to Spartanburg, and Eisenhower, I've forgotten where he went to, but anyway.
One wonders.
Yeah, but General Patch was a delightful person. He was a West Pointer, and but he was one of the most, well, I have said that of all the people that I served under during World War II, I would have rather served under him than anybody for any length of time. And well, this is one thing that I've always thought was very complimentary, at least I felt it was. I was a lieutenant, and the intelligence officer was a staff officer on the camp commander's staff, S2, like S1, S2, S3, S4, S2. Well, those places called for a lieutenant colonel. And I thought that they would, that General Patch would get somebody to come in there as assigned, but I went, and when Major Jones, my friends, had left, General Patch came over to the office one day and he sat down and talked to me and asked me about what the duties of the office were and everything, and I told him what we did. And he never, from that time on, said anything about anybody taking my place. And he left me in charge of, as his staff officer, as a lieutenant in a lieutenant colonel's place. Well, when he left, I'm going to brag about this, but when he left, he left in February of
42?
42, yeah. In the meantime, the war had, so far as we were concerned, Pearl Harbor had taken place in December, and we'll get to that in a few minutes. But General Patch had left me in that job, and when he left in February, I went to see him, and he had promoted me to captain. And I told him that I was very appreciative of his leaving me in that job, even though I was not the rank for it. And as a compliment that I thought he paid me, he said, well, when I have an opportunity to fill a place, I go and talk to the officer, and if I think he can do the job, I don't leave him alone. I leave him alone until something happens. Well, I thought that was, real complimentary, especially as I thought in the past, since that time, of the great service that General Patch made, because I was on his staff for about 6 months. They sent me to the intelligence officer school around Thanksgiving time from Atlanta, and they had the first officers training class in Chicago. So I was transferred for temporary duty at the officers training school in Chicago, and we were there the night of the attack on Pearl Harbor. Grace had a brother that was at the traffic school in Northwestern. He was the head of the state police in New Mexico. So we were glad to be up at that time, and when we came home after being out on the night of the Pearl Harbor attack, they'd been listening on the television or radio, and I mean we didn't have television, on the radio. On the radio, that the Pearl Harbor attack had taken place, and I knew then that we were going to be in the Army for quite a while, and one year idea was gone. But when I came back, the General Patch was still there, and he stayed on until he was sent about January or February. General Patch was sent to, I think it was Fort Knox, to be in charge of the, let me see, he was promoted to Major General, and he was been in charge of the American forces go to Guadalcanal to relieve the Marines who had been in Guadalcanal.
Yes, sir.
Where you may recall that our future governor, Marvin Griffin, was there with his National Guard unit.
Actually, I didn't recall that, so it's interesting for you to point that out.
Yeah. And our Georgia National Guard was one of the groups that were relieved by General Patch. And then, just to go on a little further, after the General Patch's having done that, he was brought back to Italy and put in command of the 7th Army, and when they had cleared up the attack by attacks in North Africa, he was successful in clearing out the Germans in 7th Army as one of the top commanders. And I've always been glad that I had an opportunity to know him, because he was a first-class American. And then, while I was still there, though, they brought in new commanders, new men, and they were using the infantry replacement training center at Spartanburg for the purpose of having a ranking colonel or a young colonel that they wanted to give a higher command. They wanted to let him come to Spartanburg, get a promotion there, and then go into a combat unit or other units as a general. Well, the successor to General Patch was a former Army enlisted man who in World War I had distinguished himself, and he had stayed in the Army, and he came as a colonel to succeed General Patch, and I'll have to think of his name now in a minute. But he stayed.
Maybe if you let it go for a while, maybe it'll come back later, like things do unbidden.
Well,
you're telling your story just wonderfully, and I don't want to interrupt like I'm doing right now.
Yeah. Well, he, Grace, can you remember his name? But he was a real tough soldier, and when he left Spartanburg, he was put in charge of the 1st Army, and he was on with the invasion of Europe from. I'm not sure whether the 1st Army went in from Italy or on D-Day, but I think they went in from the lower level. But he had an outstanding combat record as a leader in World War II. And in the meantime, they had a reorganization of the whole forces of the Army, and they had created the Air Force as a separate unit, and they had the Air Force and the Army and the Navy, and the Marine Corps was under the Navy, but they had taken all the service units and called them the service command units. Well, originally they had called the Atlanta area the 4th Corps area, but then they changed it to the 4th Service Command, and it handled all of the services, and the Army ran the training in Spartanburg, and they had the services separated. But when I first came there, the commanding general ran everything. But as it came about, they changed that in 1932.
42?
42, 43.
That's all right.
And they put the officers in, they had a commanding officer who was a colonel that ran the service units, you know, the special service entertainment, and all of it had a separate commanding general for the infantry replacement training center, so that he wouldn't have to be bothered with the duties of military police and all the other functions of the Army, like the post exchange and all that.
So they changed things quite a bit while you were on that.
That's right, yeah. And they had an interesting thing there. The man that they brought in to take over the training activities was an old Army West Pointer, and he had, I think, about the 16th ranking general officer in the United States Army. And he had been stationed down at Charleston, I think. And while he was stationed in Charleston, the troops there that he was commanding, he was dissatisfied with the way one of the National Guard units that was assigned to him had responded to training and everything. And so he recommended that 30 National Guard officers of the Georgia National Guard be reclassified, including the commanding general of that unit. Well, the commanding officer of that unit was General Russell, he was from Macon, Georgia. And he was a very ardent supporter of Senator Russell. I don't think they were any relation.
That was going to be my question.
And he had a lot of political clout, and so did these military officers. But the general, who was Charles, can't think of his name either, but he persisted and got his way to have that reclassified because he didn't want them going to come back, not qualified. But instead of getting a high command himself for that, they shoved him off to put him on a shelf at a training camp in Spartanburg. And he was very unhappy about it for a long time. And when he finally left, he had a command in the combat area 2 years later in the South Pacific. But the way that developed was these men came in, and another colonel came in after General Patch and the first army man, and he was promoted, and he had been a combat officer in World War I, an enlisted man, and a great machine gun man, and he was transferred and given a command at Fort Knox, at Camp Camel, Kentucky. And they went on maneuvers down in at New Orleans, Mississippi, the Army maneuvers, and his unit showed up so bad they reclassified him back to his permanent grade as a colonel. and he was the only one that I ever heard of that got reclassified. But he got his command back, but he never had his command back, you know. But then the job as public relations officer and post-intelligence officer at Spartanburg was a very nice job. And I got to know more people because as public relations officer, if any of the Chamber of Commerce or the papers wanted to know anything that was going on at the camp, they would have to get in touch with me because I had to clear anything that was published. And so that put me in touch with a whole lot of the local people beside the ones that I mentioned that were halfway kin to me. And I had some very fine young men who were enlisted personnel, but who had had a lot of newspaper training. And they kept track of things like this. Just after I arrived there, the news came about that the young man that was the president of the American Stock Exchange, who at 29 had been drafted, and that he was going to be a $21 a month private. And that made a lot of newspaper activity there. And I had an opportunity later on to, well, he finished that, let me put it this way. He finished the 13 weeks training. And they gave him his consignment, but by that time his real worth was recognized, and he was appointed a lieutenant general. I mean, not a lieutenant general, lieutenant colonel. He was appointed lieutenant colonel and put in charge of a what he had started when he was at Camp Croft while he was waiting to be of some way to. Actually, I can't think of what it is.
But it was something he had an idea for.
Yeah, an idea for, yeah, but.
And he was given the command of it when they recognized him.
Yeah.
Did you come into contact with this fella in Spartanburg?
No.
But
I had heard about him. I never did meet him because he finished just about the time that I got there. But when I went to Washington as a member of Congress, this young man who had made a good record as a buck private had become the head of the Federal Reserve in Washington.
And you were elected to Congress in what year?
In 1961. I was elected in 61.
So
but,
your paths crossed again.
Well, he and I became great friends. And because all the legislation dealing with the Federal Reserve and money came to the Banking Committee. And he had also become a very close friend of John Sibley, who was the president of the Trust Company of Georgia Bank, after he had got out of the law firm that he represented, the Coca-Cola Company and everything. And he took the job, I mean, not beside the Federal Reserve Bank job, he became a director in the Berry School up in Rome. And
you remember his name?
yeah, I can't. I will have to. Yeah, well, we'll have to. But anyway, the I'm trying to. Oh, and then another thing that was very interesting too. He came before our committee one day to testify on the Federal Reserve plan, and this was right after I had come up there. And he had with him, as his chief counselor for the Federal Reserve, a young man, and I realized it was Charlie Maloney from Dublin.
Dublin, Georgia.
Yeah, and he had been in college with me and had initiated me into the KA fraternity. So all this Army experience and everything all mixed up together. But anyway, the stay there at Spartanburg was a fine experience for me, and we were not too far away from home, and we had all these contacts. But then our second child was expected in 1943, and Grace had been going to the doctor there in Spartanburg, and I thought it's going to be a tough thing, but this is going to be the first child in our family born out of the state of Georgia since 1750. Be born in South Carolina was bad enough. Well, I got orders transferring me to the information, well, they called them then the Morale Services,
In Lexington.
Morale Services Division, a new division that was being organized, and it was to provide information and education on the war progress and organizing units in all stations and posts and everywhere. And it was a new organization, a new idea, and I was assigned there to that school, and Grace and the, well, let me see, that I was assigned to that school.
You went on up there. And
Yeah, I went on up there, that's right. And she stayed, well, no, she went home to Washington, Georgia, and had the little boy in Washington, Georgia. My father was practicing medicine down there then after he had been in Atlanta. And he called me up and told me that we had a new baby. And I said, well, that's fine. Says, Grace is doing fine. I said, well, that's fine. Says, how much did the baby, he said the baby weighed 6 pounds, and says, everything's just fine. I said, well, Grace is doing fine. I said, well, will you please tell me, is it a boy or a girl? He was just pulling my leg, you know.
So he dragged it out.
Yeah, he dragged it out. But anyway, when he was 6 weeks old, we drove to Lexington, Virginia, and we were there for about 3 months, I guess. And then they transferred me, after I had finished that, transferred us to Atlanta and put me into the new Information Education Division that was being created for the 4th Service Command. And I was scheduled to be assigned to a combat unit. That didn't any specific one, but when the temporary duty in Atlanta was over, I was supposed to be assigned to a combat unit to be in charge of information and education for the troops in that unit. Well, that wasn't too good prospect. Well, it just happened that I had already mentioned Charlie Maloney, who was the one that was a KA with the Federal Reserve.
From Dublin, Georgia?
From Dublin, yeah. And Ben Camp was another KA, like Asa Kenley, who was, and I told you about it.
So they were all your fraternity brothers?
Yeah, but Ben was with the classification section, and he was supposed to procure people to fill that new information education division that was set up. And I got to talking about the fact that I just finished that school, and so he said, well, I'll just get you assigned here in Atlanta. Well, that relieved us a little bit, because I thought I was going overseas, you know, with a combat unit, and I just couldn't very well see myself doing anything as a combat, as an information education officer with a combat unit. I couldn't envisage that as any delightful job to have. So we spent a year and a half in Atlanta. And
I'm imagining this is about 1943
it's 43
to
4, yeah. And in the meantime, the whole European war had really begun with the General Clarke's invasion of North Africa, and then of the sweep across there to take Rommel's army away before they could invade France. And we followed it, and of course, we were responsible for a lot of information that you could give out to the post in camp station. And the war progress in Europe made it look like that everybody could see that the war was going to come to an end in Germany sooner than they had thought. But also, General Uhl, who was the head of the Fourth Service Command, the general in charge, issued directions that everybody who had not been overseas was going overseas. And this was about April of 1944, when the war they had the Yalta Conference and things had begun to show that we were going to win after D-Day and everything. And he had issued that order. And again, I could see myself going overseas, you know, to someplace that, with the war still going on. Well, one day, a young officer that I had met at Spartanburg and who had been a staff officer up there, and when he and I had become friends, he was working with the OSS. And he had been into Atlanta 2 or 3 times, and I had seen him, and he had come down there every time soliciting recruits for some OSS business. He was looking for soldiers that could speak French, or they were going to be sent as undercover agents around. So I asked him, I said, what are you looking for this time? Well, he said, we're looking for officers to help try the major Nazi criminals at Nuremberg. And I said, and I told him, I said, well, you finally found somebody. I said, I speak German, and I bragged about how much German I knew. And I said, I wouldn't mind having that assignment. Well, this boy's name was Joe Brown, incidentally.
Joe Brown.
Yeah. So he said he'd left Spartanburg as a captain. He was about a colonel by this time. He said, well, I recommend you. So I got orders assigning me to the staff of Chief of Justice Robert Jackson as a lawyer for the Nuremberg trial because of the experience I'd had as background in Germany. And it was right unusual that somehow most everybody that was assigned was a lawyer, which it should have been. But so far as the staff of Mr. Jackson was concerned, direct staff, in the document division to document and to perform services for trial briefs and so forth. I was the only one as a lawyer and in a German. And you know, it was a surprise to me. But how could you take a document and read it and see what the document said? When somebody had translated it from German into English, you don't know whether, and I found out that several of the documents that the translation staffs had given, and I sent to me, I wrote the trial brief for the SS and for the brown shirts that were tried. And several documents I got didn't say in German what the translators had said, like to send and transport German Jews. Well, these documents didn't say to send and transport. They just, you know, had said that it would be, you know, that would be catch them and send them. Well, that didn't say that. Well, that's the experience that I had. And I stayed there. Well, let me get back just a minute. I had received my orders that to go to Washington, D.C., being signed to the Office of Strategic Services about the 1st of July of 1945. And I left the headquarters there, and I went up thinking I was going within a month. Well, the colonel in charge of the unit that was the Information Education Division said he wouldn't let me go till he got my replacement. Well, he didn't need the replacement because by the time that we're talking about, we didn't have hardly any troops left in the Fourth Service Command, and our services were down to nothing practically.
The war in Europe hadn't ended.
No, not quite. It was closing, but still going on. And I was a little bit frustrated because I would have been the aide to Mr. Jackson if I had gotten released. But by the time that they got somebody to replace me, that was filled. But I was still going on there. But it took a month for them to get it all straightened out between July the 1st and the time that I left. Well, I was jumping back to Atlanta to be with the family and back and forth taking leave, and then finally they settled it for me to leave, and I was to leave on the 13th day of August and take a plane from Washington to Europe. And the morning that my plane was supposed to leave, I was staying at Fort what's that place in Virginia?
Washington.
Yeah. I was staying in temporary quarters out there, and I went to breakfast. And my plane was supposed to leave at 12 o'clock. And the mess sergeant, I heard him hollering way back in the back. He came running through the whole dining room. "The war is over, the war is over." I said, "Oh, Lord." Here I am going overseas for the first time, and the war is over in Europe. Well, I went on, and I got on the airplane there at Andrews, I think it was, and flew down to the Bermuda, and they had a stop there, a night stop, and then I flew to Orly Air Force Base, and I got to Paris, and the Stars and Stripes is the first paper that I saw. There was the Army paper.
Yes, sir.
And the headline says, "The war is over." And it was August the 14th, 1945, and that was my birthday. And I was going overseas for the first time. But I stayed in Nuremberg from August to November. And had a very interesting experience, and I have written up a lot of that experience. But I found out that the trial would begin on the 20th of November, the actual trials would. In the meantime, I had seen them repair the Palace of Justice, and I had worked on the trial briefs that were to be given. And I suddenly realized one day, by some information that I got, that the war being over in Europe, they were cutting down on the staff, the sizes of the army, and they said that anybody who had 72 hours of active duty could apply for getting out of the Army. Well, see, this was about the 1st of November that order came through. And the trials were not to begin to the 20th. I knew that I wasn't going to be one of the prosecutors. I did have opportunity to have interrogation of people like Carlton Brunner, who was the Secret Service, and I saw Goering there, but never did get a chance to interrogate him. But a lot of the other people. But I knew that I wasn't going to do any of the trial business. And that if I stayed on, I wasn't going to be anything but observe it a little bit, maybe get my picture taken once. And I said to myself, if Grace ever finds out that I had enough points to get out, and I stayed over there to see these people tried, I just well stay away the rest of my life. So I made application for getting out of the service.
A house to sell and all that.
I made application for getting out, and it was approved. And I left Nuremberg about the 12th of November to give myself time to. I wanted to go to see a young man that had been my assistant at Spartanburg, and I had gotten him into the intelligence. And by that time, he was head of the intelligence unit for the 7th Army under General Patch. And he was stationed at Heidelberg. And I had never been to Heidelberg, and I wanted to go to Heidelberg because I had had an uncle in the 1970s who had studied medicine there. And he had always been interested in the fact that I went to school in Germany too, and I wanted to go there. So I went there and stayed a week, and then I got the plane out of Germany and went to Paris. And incidentally, while I was in Heidelberg, Lieutenant Hammond, he was captain by this time, had major, he and I went to the office club that was in Heidelberg on a mountain there. And we were having dinner, and he introduced me to a young girl that was in a Red Cross uniform. And I noticed she spoke broken English. And I found out when we were talking there that her name was Punga, P-U-N-G-A. So I said, "Where were you from?" And she said, "Latvia." I said, "Well, when I was in school in Hamburg, Germany, the Latvian consul was named Punga, and his son and I and a group of us got up in a basketball team to play basketball. And we went to play with some, this was before the war, of course, to play with some German officers in Berlin. And Punga got his father's big Cadillac automobile, and we went up to play together. And she said, yes, that was my brother. Mm-hmm. And said he became an ambulance driver for the Americans, like I'm in the Red Cross. And then I said, well, what about your parents? He said that they were drawn back to Latvia by Hitler and disappeared when they killed them. Never heard of them.
I think we're only learning some of the history of the...
That's right. Well, anyway, that was just a sidelight. But I decided that after I went to Paris, and I had to wait a week before I could get my plane. I didn't realize that was going to be that delayed. I had my orders and everything, and they had the biggest fog they'd ever had in Paris for years. And no plane was coming in, no plane going out. And I had told Grace I'd be home on the 27th of November, her birthday.
Did it keep you from making her birthday? Well,
I got to Washington and spent the night, and I got transportation out to the airport. I had my orders to fly, but I didn't have any reservation. And I got out to the airport, And I waited all day from 8 o'clock in the morning until 6 o'clock at night. I think some general came in and got my seat. But anyway, Grace was waiting in Athens for me because she's going to meet me in Atlanta. And I finally got on the boat, on the plane at 6 o'clock, by the 27th of March, or November. And we came down one time I think in Virginia, someplace. And I ran in while they were talking, and I called Grace and telephoned and told her to meet me in Atlanta, that I was on the way. So she got a friend and met me in Atlanta, but to our consternation, Atlanta was fogged in, and I had landed in Macon, Georgia.
Terrible evening.
And circumstances were such, I didn't know how I was going to get information to her because she'd already gone to Atlanta. But I called up the airport, the Atlanta airport, and I don't know how I got the number. And Grace was standing in the airport. It wasn't half as what it is now, you know. And I went a third. And Grace was standing there, wondering what to do. And she heard the telephone ring over there. Pay telephone, I think it was.
It was an open.
Yeah, she picked it up, and it was me, saying that I would be there and to wait, that I was going to take a taxi cab from Macon to Atlanta. And it cost me $35, but you know what, that was in 1940.
$1946.
5. But we finally got together.
By then it was morning.
It was the day after our birthday. But that ended our war activities, and so far as...
Why don't I give your voice a rest and give the microphone for a moment or a few moments to your wife and ask her the same question about those World War II years.
I didn't leave you much to say.
No, that's true.
Well,
That's true. But
still,
from the woman's standpoint, I can add a few
I'm
things.
very interested.
Where is this?
You can
just
pin that
stick it
just
in
to
one
the
place?
top of your, or to the top of your dress. There.
Okay. That close enough?
That works like a charm.
All right.
And I have just had a précis, and we reached a natural stopping place. I'll come back to your husband, but I would appreciate hearing some of your thoughts about Spartanburg or raising a family or some of the various hardships of those years.
All right. Of course, war was completely new to me. I was not a historian. I did hear about World War I when I was a child because I had an uncle who was in the Army, and I knew a little bit, but very little. I grew up in Athens on a farm, and my life was practical. Everything was in a practical mood. And so I had, very little reason to be interested in world affairs because it was a small world that I lived in. But after we got married, he was going to practice law, and in fact, when we first got married, I thought he was going to be a teacher. And we'd have this nice, quiet, pleasant academic life on the University of Georgia campus, and I'd grown up in Athens, so I was just very excited about that. And we'd always planned to have 4 children, and life was going along famously until this war came along. And then I suddenly realized that there might be some bad times for us. And he had just gotten his law degree, and we weren't going to be in the academic world like I had thought, but I didn't think too badly of the law. And I thought, well, we'll still live in Athens and everything will be pleasant. Come on in.
Interrupt. I believe the next interview subjects are here. If you wouldn't mind.
Hi.
While they're...
How are you?
Would you like to come in, gentlemen, and sit along this wall?
Hey, John. How are you? Glad to see you.
How are you?
I've been
Listening
to some
How are
of
you?
the story, and I'd
Glad
like to
to
ask
see
you
you.
questions. I certainly am glad that you can talk to him all
2 more
here.
days, I think. He can tell stories from him.
Absolutely.
I'll tell you one story that you might be interested in. You're going to interview 2 of my former pupils.
That's right.
That's right. I taught him in the history.
First teacher over there at the university.
Yeah.
Was he really?
Uh-huh.
Your first
Very
one?
first class.
That's right.
Up in the old academic building.
Oh my goodness.
Look how dark it was.
A long time ago.
John Stegman, Dr. Goodall.
We don't want to take up any of their time, but
I don't really feel that it's a conflict as long as I can. I'd still like to hear. I'll ask a few questions, but I'd
Okay.
still like to hear. I've asked Mrs. Stephens to.
see,
give me
he's
some
been at it till right now. I promise I haven't said a word, have
We know her,
I? Okay.
But you had mentioned to me that you were the child of a faculty. No, you were grown up in Athens.
Hmm. My father was a farmer, and he was head of the university dairy and farm over at the university for 25 years, and that's where I grew up.
What was your maiden
Delightful.
name?
Winston.
Thank you.
Hmm. Grace Winston. But let's see, where were we?
Do you remember perhaps Pearl Harbor, how you heard?
Oh,
about
yes, yes. It was most unusual. All our family thought we'd lost our minds because we took our 7-month-old baby up to Chicago in November for Bob to go to this training school up there. Well, our idea of marriage was stick together, no matter what. And we slept in this little apartment that had belonged to my brother for a short time because he had been up there in school. And it was Thanksgiving night, and we were trying to get the baby to sleep. She was 7 months old then. And we sat down on the floor in a dark closet and had our Thanksgiving sandwich that we had bought downstairs. That was our Thanksgiving, which was most unusual because we had big family deals when we were at home. But that was just part of the whole story. The things that you remember most, I guess, or when you were doing things that you wouldn't ordinarily be doing. But another thing was that we decided we'd have our second baby during the war, and people thought we'd lost our mind. What do you mean having a baby during the war? You don't know what's going to happen. You don't know what the future is. I said, I don't care what happens. I'd rather have 2 children than just one. I feel sorry for single children. So anyhow, we went ahead. And the last 2 weeks of my pregnancy, I had changed doctors 3 times because all of them had been hauled off to the war. So I ended up with a lady doctor in Spartanburg, South Carolina. And as I was leaving town, she said, you better pack a suitcase because you're liable to have that baby any minute. So pack a suitcase and be ready to stop the first hospital you come to. Well, it was a little bit longer than that, so I went straight to Washington, Georgia, where Bob's family was, and they took us all in, the little girl and this new baby about to appear. And then when he was 6 weeks old, we got in the car and drove straight to Lexington, Virginia, where Bob had suddenly been transferred to. And we stayed there about 2 months, and that was when, no help. Washing diapers, you didn't have disposable diapers then. I was washing diapers in the tub and all that kind of thing, just the small things that happened. But you didn't worry too much about all that, knowing it was all just not going to be lasting too long. But then we were transferred back to Atlanta, and that was a disappointment. We were all set to stay in Lexington for a while, we had hoped. Beautiful place. Children were happy there, what little they knew of life.
The colonel, head of the school, had invited me to stay there and be intelligence officer, but they wouldn't let me do it from Atlanta.
So that was then we went to Atlanta and finally got us a place to live, bought us a little house, and then of course all the rationing was on at that point. Your gasoline was rationed, all the paper products and all that sort of thing. And meat, you couldn't get meat very often, and I'll never forget that once we were going to have some company, and I had saved up all my coupons, and I bought a ham. And I somehow or other, with the excitement of all the children and everything, I left that ham in the oven twice as long as it was supposed to have been left, and when I looked in at it, it was just shrunk up into nothing. It was just strings. I remember those things. And then, of course, when Bob decided he was going to Germany, I had to sell that house on my own, and that was a new experience for me. I was not versed in, that sort of thing. So we did sell the house, though, and moved to back to Washington, Georgia, where Bob's family was, and stayed there until he came back from his trip.
While he was in Nuremberg, you were in Washington, Georgia?
Yeah. And let's see, the children by then were about 2.5 and 4.5.
Well, let me take one experience there. When I was going to Nuremberg, my father and mother came up to Atlanta, and Grace and the children, they were going to see me off at the airport. And Rob was 2, just learning to talk. And it was a sad day for Grace because I was going, overseas, and she didn't know what was going to happen. But when she was on the way home, Rob, she was standing out there on the airport sidelines, where the airplanes were going up. And I had just gotten on the airplane when Rob looked up at Grace and says, "Daddy's gonna fall." Grace cried all the way.
Terrible. But those are just very few things that I remember.
Well, that's
You didn't say where you heard about Pearl Harbor.
Oh, I'm sorry. For one time, thank you, for once, we had a babysitter. I had been in the apartment on the 7th floor with a baby who was too heavy for me to carry, but too small to walk. And so I was just caught there. He would leave early in the morning and not come back till night. And there I was. And I would try to get out. It was pretty chilly weather, and we were right on the Lake Superior. What is the one that we were by? Where's Chicago?
Michigan.
Michigan, Lake Michigan, of course. Anyway, I borrowed a little baby carriage from some friend, and or at least an acquaintance, and would take her out and try to give her a little fresh air. And that was the only exercise I had, was that. And the rest of the time she was in the apartment with me with this very small area, and it was a tough time. But we had gotten, my sister and her sister-in-law had told us she would keep the baby and we could go to a movie. First movie we'd been to in months. So when we got out of the movie, the people were shouting all up and down the street, "Pearl Harbor's been attacked, Pearl Harbor's been attacked." Well, we were just, it was like fire coming out of the clouds or something, because we thought, well, what are they going to do with you now? Where are they going to send you? Where are we going? What are we going to do? We knew we could be going straight home. But it was well, I guess something you'll never forget, the first time you heard about it. Of course, then we poured over the newspapers, listened to the radio, and tried to figure out what was the future.
Grace, did you know what Pearl Harbor was when you heard that?
No, I really didn't. I just knew that it was, I think I knew it was in Hawaii, but that's about all I knew.
I didn't know what Hawaii was.
I didn't know. I didn't know all our Navy was down there, and that we were losing practically everything we had as far as the Navy was concerned.
I think it's a very important place. Never heard of it. Where the hell is Pearl Harbor?
Where were you?
In Atlanta.
Well, you.
Emory,
Uh-huh.
in medical school.
Yeah.
Well, it's like the days when people ask you, everybody seems to know what they were doing the day Kennedy shot himself, except one little girl. And I was asking her, I said, everybody does, where were you? I wasn't born. Made me feel old as
story. In the interest of time, I'd like to perhaps maybe ask you all some more questions another time. But the last question I usually ask at these interviews, I generally ask people a summing up question, just like I tossed out a big question. If you were talking to younger people who might only know of World War II through books and history, or even these videotapes, I'm going to ask your wife first because I'd like to pin the microphone back upon you. What do you think is most important from that time that you experienced, Mrs. Stephens?
You learn to take it. You just learn that all these things are going to eventually be solved, and you just live from day to day and just hope everything's going to turn out all right. And we were very fortunate that we had no tragedies, and it was an extremely interesting time. You're so caught up in raising your family that you almost became we were in the Army for 4.5 years. And so,
days.
in 5 minutes. But I don't know exactly what I would say to young people, but I'd probably have to think about it a little bit before I could come to any kind of great conclusion.
I think you just think that like to pin this back upon your
Okay.
husband and ask him, like I did your wife. The question I usually ask to sum up one of these interviews, after I've asked a few more questions that I'm going to lay aside, is simply what's most important from those times.
Well, I did not intend to stay in the service, but I knew that I would get out eventually. But what has always been satisfactory to me is that I did serve for the over 4 years, almost 5 years, and that I would have rather been in the service than out. I've never regretted a moment of being in the Army, and I felt that even though that we were probably as fortunate as any two could have been, because we were separated such a short time. But if I had a choice again, I would be in the Army rather than not be in the Army. And that I felt that it was my duty to be there, and that if I could be like that fellow said, that, did you have any fighting? He said, yeah, I fought for 5 years for anybody that tried to send me overseas. But at least I never dodged any assignment because I was fortunate I didn't have to do anything except I got assignments that were very nice, and I did get transferred because I wasn't doing my job. But I just was satisfied to be in the service. And I guess like Ed Goodloe and John, all of us here, we had ancestors that fought for America, and we felt like we were following family tradition. And that anything that we could do to preserve America from the domination of the Nazis and communism, we should do it.
Very much, Mrs. Stephens. Now, would you mind telling me how you had these two fine gentlemen as students?
Well, I was teaching in the history department in 1937, 36 through 39, and I started the social science survey courses they had over there, and everybody had to take that. And John was fortunate in this respect that I had all the freshman football players in my class. Dr. Payne put them in my class, and then of course Goodloe, like I said the other day, I had helped Goodloe get to be a Phi Beta Kappa because he got A in my class. And I think you did get A too, John.
No, you didn't give me one.
What's that?
You didn't give me a Phi Beta Kappa.
No, but I mean, yeah.
I thought it was just another football player.
That's right.
I think I got a D.
But the time that we spent, well, we made a lot of friends. We met a lot of different people, you know, and everything was worthwhile. Well, now, one of the things that I have to tell you, I've told him this twice now, but I'll tell you all again. He called me up and wanted me to come to take part in this, and I told him I'd be glad to. And I asked him where he was from, and he said he was from Atlanta. And then we got to talking, and he said, you may know who my grandfather was, Wright Bryan, who I said, oh yes, I know Wright Bryan. He ran the Atlanta papers, and I said, my father was a doctor for Wright Bryan's grandfather, Colonel William A. Wright, who was Comptroller General of Georgia. And you can bear this story again, can't you?
I can stand it, and I'm going to tell my grandma pretty soon now.
And he had the story that he told my father that during the Civil War, he had been wounded and they had to amputate his leg. And that it bothered him, and then it got better, and finally he just didn't know what he could do. He told the doctor, said, I feel like ants are crawling on my leg, that stub, and I just can't stop them. And he told Father, said, I finally went out to the battlefield and found where they had buried my leg, and when I dug it up, sure enough, ants were crawling all over it.
Isn't bad telling that?